The dirt road seemed longer than he remembered, perhaps because the last time he'd driven that way, he was still a whole man. Renato drove with the window open, his arm resting on the door, feeling the warm wind of the Minas Gerais countryside brush against his face like an ancient hand trying to recognize him. The car kicked up the red dust, and he drove slowly, not out of concern for the potholes, but because he was no longer in a hurry to get anywhere. At 43, he had sold his apartment in Belo Horizonte, resigned from the engineering firm where he'd worked for 18 years, and packed only one suitcase. He carried few clothes, no plans, and a weariness so profound it seemed to have settled into his bones as if his own skeleton had given up supporting that body before he did. The property was inherited from his father, 8 hectares of good land that nobody wanted. His older sister got his mother's apartment. His middle brother got the car and the savings. Renato got the property because nobody believed it was worth anything. Land far away, an old house, no cell phone signal, no neighbors nearby. Perfect, he thought when he signed the papers at the notary's office 2 years earlier. Perfect for someone who doesn't want to be found. The divorce had been silent, like everything else in the marriage. Claudia never yelled, never threw anything, never made a scene. She simply became transparent within her own home until one day Renato realized she had been gone for weeks, and he hadn't noticed the difference. Not because he didn't care, but because her absence was almost identical to her presence. When the lawyer called, Renato said, "Everything's fine," so naturally that the lawyer himself fell silent for a few seconds, waiting for an emotion that didn't come. It wasn't coldness, it was exhaustion. Renato had spent so many years trying to be what others expected. The present husband, the competent engineer, the son who doesn't complain, the man who gets things done, that when everything crumbled, he simply had no more fuel to react. Then came the farm. The idea of silence, of mornings without commitments, of coffee made on a wood-burning stove, of nights with crickets and nothing more. He didn't. He was running away. Or perhaps he was. But running away, when it's the only honest gesture left, can also be an act of courage. When the car rounded the last bend and the house appeared between the mango trees, Renato stopped. He didn't pull over. He stopped in the middle of the road, because there was smoke coming from the chimney. He stood there for a long time, the engine running, his hands on the steering wheel. The house was simple. Whitewashed walls, blue windows, a wooden porch with a bench his father had made. But now there were clothes on the clothesline, small clothes, colorful, and a red tricycle leaning against the entrance step. Renato turned off the engine and got out of the car slowly, like someone approaching an animal that might flee or attack. He walked to the wooden gate, which was ajar, and then heard a voice inside. A woman's voice. She sang softly, almost murmuring, a formless melody, as if she were inventing the song as she sang. And along with the voice, the sound of water hitting a pan, and a child's laughter. Renato pushed open the gate and climbed the 3 steps to the porch. The living room door was open. He stopped in the doorway and saw a young woman, perhaps 30 years old, her hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a simple cotton dress, her bare feet on the polished cement floor. She was facing away, washing dishes in an aluminum basin, and beside her, seated in a chair that was too high, a girl of about 4 was drawing with crayons on a piece of cardboard. The kitchen was clean, cleaner than Renato had ever seen it. There was an embroidered dish towel hanging on a hook on the wall, a vase of wildflowers on the table, and the smell of beans cooking mixed with burning wood. The woman turned around as if she had sensed his presence before hearing any sound. Her eyes were brown, large, and carried the kind of fear that doesn't come from fright, but from life itself. An ancient, ingrained fear. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She gripped the dishcloth tightly with both hands and stood there looking at it, as if she already knew what was coming. Then, the girl looked up from the drawing and smiled at Renato as if he were an expected visitor. "This house is mine," he said. It wasn't rude. It wasn't kind. It was simply a fact. The woman swallowed hard. "I know," she replied. Her voice was firm, but her body trembled. "Mr. Onofre said the owner wasn't coming anymore, that he had abandoned it." Onofre was the closest neighbor, an old man in his 80s who looked after the fence and watched the land from afar in exchange for being able to use the pasture for his cattle. Renato felt a heat rise up his neck, not from anger at his wife, from anger at himself for having neglected everything for so long that even an intruder had been authorized by a stranger. "Mr. Onofre doesn't have the authority to let anyone live here," Renato said, entering the kitchen. He looked around. The house was different. The walls had been cleaned. The bathroom, which had a broken shower the last time, now worked. There were new curtains on the windows. The yard, which had been overgrown with weeds, now had a small vegetable garden with tomatoes, chives, and kale. The woman remained silent. The girl climbed down from her chair and went to her, holding the hem of her dress. "Mom, who is the young man?" "He's the owner of the house, Leah." The girl looked at Renato with that absurd seriousness that only children possess. "Are you going to live here too?" Renato didn't answer. He looked at the woman. "What's your name?" "Isadora." "Isadora, I don't know what Onofre told you, but I came to stay. This house is mine. It's in the deed. It's in my name, and I didn't authorize anyone to enter." Isadora nodded slowly. "I know, sir. I can put things together. I just need a day." "Where are you going?" She didn't answer, and her silence spoke louder than any words. There was nowhere to go. Renato looked at the girl. Leah had gone back to the cardboard and was drawing a house with a huge tree beside it. The house in the drawing had 2 blue windows and an open door. Renato left without saying anything. He went to the car, took the suitcase out of the trunk, returned to the porch, and sat on the wooden bench his father had made. He stayed there for a long time, watching the sun set behind the hills, listening to the sounds of the woman inside tidying things, the girl talking to herself with her drawings. He thought about calling someone, but he had no one to call. He thought about going to the city to sort things out at the police station, but the nearest police station was 40 minutes away, and he didn't have the energy for bureaucracy. He thought about simply sending the 2 women away and locking the door, but the smell of beans was still in the air, and it had been years since someone had cooked for him. Not that she had cooked for him, but the smell made no distinction. As darkness fell, Isadora appeared at the balcony door. "Sir, I made food. There's enough for you, too, if you want some. I'll be leaving early tomorrow morning." Renato looked at her. The kitchen light came from behind, outlining her silhouette in the doorway, and for a second he thought she looked like one of those stained glass church figures illuminated from within. He stood up and went inside. The table was set for 3. Rice, beans, sautéed kale, a fried egg. Simple. Perfect. The little girl was already seated, her feet dangling off the ground. Renato sat at the head of the table in the place that had been her father's, and ate in silence. Isadora ate little, almost nothing. She watched her daughter eat, adjusting the girl's hair, wiping the corner of her mouth with her thumb. There was such absolute devotion in that gesture that Renato felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He knew that kind of love, the love of someone who has nothing else but one person to protect. After dinner, Isadora washed the dishes, bathed the girl, and the 2 went to the back room. Renato stayed in the living room. The house had 2 bedrooms. He entered the front room, which was his father's, and found the bed made with clean sheets. There was a sprig of dried rosemary on the pillow. He lay down and stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the silence of the countryside, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like disappearing. He felt only a warm strangeness, like when you enter a place that isn't yours, but that smells as it should smell. In the early morning, Renato woke to a sound. The girl was crying. It wasn't a loud cry, a low constant moan, as if she were dreaming of something she didn't yet have words to describe. He heard Isadora's voice whispering, "I'm here, my love. I'm here. Nothing will happen." And the girl gradually fell silent, like a river that finds a deeper section and calms down. Renato turned to his side and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. He kept thinking that perhaps this was what he had forgotten, that there are people in the world whose greatest act of courage is simply not leaving. In the morning, when he left the room, Isadora was already in the kitchen, coffee brewed in a cloth filter, cornbread on the stove, table set. Her suitcase was ready by the door, an old canvas backpack with a mended strap. The girl held a rag doll and looked out the window as if she were saying goodbye to the trees. "Where are you going?" Renato asked again, sitting down at the table. Isadora served the coffee and placed the cup in front of him. "I'm going to town. I'll see if I can find somewhere." "Do you have family?" "No." "And the girl's father?" Isadora didn't answer, but the hand holding the teapot trembled enough to spill a drop of coffee on the tablecloth. She wiped it quickly, as if hiding the mistake was a reflex. "Leah's father left before she was born," she said after a while. "I lived with him in a rented apartment in Sete Lagoas. When he found out about the pregnancy, he disappeared. The rent was in his name. I was evicted when I was 7 months pregnant. A neighbor took me in until I gave birth. Then I went to a shelter, then to another, then to the street, until I got here. Mr. Onofre saw me sleeping under the mango tree with Leah and said the house was empty, that the owner had left and never came back." She told everything without crying, without dramatizing, like someone describing a journey they had walked, tiring but completed. Renato drank his coffee slowly. The cornbread was good, better than anything he'd eaten in the last 2 years. "How long have you been here?" 8 months. 8 months? He repeated, not as a question, but as a measure, 8 months taking care of a house that wasn't hers. 8 months planting a vegetable garden in someone else's yard. 8 months turning an abandoned place into something that resembled a home. "I fixed the shower," she said, as if she needed to justify staying. "And the roof gutter. There was a leak in the front room. I replaced 3 tiles, and I cleaned the well. The water was dirty." Renato looked at her. Isadora had rough hands, short nails, and sun-marked skin on her face. She wasn't a woman who expected to be saved. She was a woman who had learned to build herself up from what she found on the ground. "Stay," he said. Isadora looked up. "How?" "Stay, at least until you sort out your situation. The house has 2 bedrooms. You stay in the back one with the girl. I'll stay in the front one." "Sir, I don't want charity." "It's not charity. You fixed my roof, my shower, cleaned my well. There's a vegetable garden over there that I would never have the patience to plant. If you want, we can make a deal. You take care of the house. I don't charge anything. Whenever you want to go, go." Isadora stood still, holding the teapot with both hands, looking at him as if searching for a trap. Because in her life, every offer had a price. Every roof over her head had a condition. Every man who opened a door wanted something in return. Renato saw the fear in her eyes and understood. "I don't want anything from you, Isadora. I came here to be alone. I'm still alone. Only with someone by my side." She didn't answer right away. She went to the window where Leah was drawing on the fogged glass with her finger. The girl had written something that looked like house in crooked letters. Isadora looked at her daughter and then at Renato. "Okay," she said. "But whenever you want me to go, just let me know." "It's okay." And so began a coexistence that neither of them had planned and that neither of them knew how to name. In the first few days, they lived like 2 planets in separate orbits within the same solar system. Renato would wake up early, have coffee, and go to the land. He began to clear the pasture, repair the fence, cut the grass around the house. Hard physical labor that made his body ache and his mind quiet. Isadora stayed in the house, cooked, washed, tended the garden, taught Leah to count to 20 using corn kernels. They crossed paths at mealtimes and exchanged few words. "The rice is good. The gate needs oil. Leah slept well." Short, functional phrases, like messages between 2 castaways who shared the same raft without knowing each other's names. But cohabitation has its own physics. When 2 bodies occupy the same space for long enough, gravity does the work that willpower cannot. Renato began to notice things. The way Isadora wrung out the dishcloth when she was nervous. The way she sang softly while hanging out laundry, always the same melody without lyrics. The way she held Leah in her lap when the girl cried at night, not with despair, but with an almost geological firmness, as if her body were made to be a shelter. And he also noticed the sadness. Because Isadora smiled at Leah all day long, but when the girl slept, the smile disappeared as if it were a garment she took off at the end of the workday. There were moments when Renato saw her sitting on the back porch, staring into nothingness, her hands still in her lap, and her face had the expression of someone calculating how much longer she could endure. Renato didn't ask, not because he didn't care, but because he knew that certain pains only leave when they decide to leave, and forcing the door is worse than waiting. It was Leah who broke the distance. Children don't respect emotional protocols. One Saturday afternoon, Renato was on the balcony sanding a board to fix the bench, and Leah appeared with a glass of orange juice. "Mom sent it," she said, and stood there watching him work. After a while, she asked, "Can I help?" Renato gave her a piece of sandpaper and a piece of wood. The girl sanded with absurd seriousness, as if she were performing surgery. When she finished, she proudly showed him the result, and Renato said, "It looks good." Leah smiled so wide that he felt his eyes burn. From that day on, Leah became his shadow. She followed him to the pasture, to the corral, to the yard. She asked him questions about everything. "Why does the cow do that? How old is that tree? Do you know how to whistle?" "Renato." He answered with a patience he didn't even know he possessed, and he began to realize that something within him, which had been hardened, was softening, like a stuck door that someone pushes a little bit every day until it gives way. One night, Isadora apologized. "Is Leah bothering you? I'll tell her to stop." "No, it's not. She's never had anyone, no men around. She doesn't know how to act. She behaves well, better than most adults I know." Isadora remained silent, and then, almost in a whisper, "Thank you." Time passed, and with time their orbits drew closer, without fanfare, without declaration. The meals grew longer. Renato began to tell stories about his father, about his childhood on that farm, about the time he fell from the mango tree and broke his arm, and his father carried him to the hospital on horseback. Isadora listened attentively and sometimes laughed. When she laughed, something in the kitchen became clearer, as if someone had turned on a light that Renato didn't know existed. And Isadora also began to tell stories, little by little, in pieces, like someone dismantling a bomb wire by wire. She recounted growing up in Montes Claros, the daughter of a single mother who worked as a cleaner in 3 houses, that her mother died when she was 17, that she worked as a supermarket cashier, a fast food attendant, and a maid, that she met Leah's father at a dance and thought that finally someone had chosen her. "He said I was special," she said one night, her voice devoid of emotion, as if recounting a historical fact. But I was just convenient. It's different. Renato felt a rage he didn't know where to contain, not towards her, against the world, against all men who treat presents as possession and affection, as a tool. But he said nothing, because sometimes the silence of a man who listens is more valuable than any word of comfort. There was one day that changed everything. It wasn't a special day. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September with that dry heat that cracks your lips and makes the ground creak. Renato had gone to town to buy wire for his fence. On the way back, he stopped at the corner store and met Donna Merencia, the owner of the general store, who knew everyone within a 50-kilometer radius. "Renato, my son, I heard you went back to your father's farm, and I also heard you're with a woman there." She said, "a woman," with that tone that transforms a person into a category. People are talking about it. Look, they say she came from out of town, that she has no family, that nobody knows where she came from. You have to be careful, my son. These people appear out of nowhere, settle in, and when you realize it, they've already taken over everything. Renato took the change and looked at Donna Merencia with a calmness that startled even him. "Donna Merencia, did you clean my well? Did you fix my roof? Did you plant food in my yard?" The woman blinked. "No, but..." "So, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about." He left the corner store with the wire and his heart pounding, not out of anger at the old woman, but because, in defending Isadora, he had felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that seemed purposeful. When he arrived home, he found Isadora sitting on the porch with red eyes. Leah was sleeping inside. He sat on the bench next to her, without asking anything. They remained silent for a time that could have been 5 minutes or an hour. "I went to the school today," Isadora said. "To try to enroll Leah. The secretary asked for proof of residence. I said I lived here. She asked if it was my house. I said no. She asked whose it was. I said it was a man's. She looked at me in a way of, it's a way I already know. That way people look at you and they think they know everything about you just because you don't have a piece of paper to show." Renato remained quiet. "I'm used to it," Isadora continued. "But Leah doesn't deserve this. She deserves to go to school. She deserves to have a place to live. She deserves not to be ashamed to say where she lives." Renato stood up. "I'll go with you tomorrow." And so it was. The next morning, he put on a clean shirt, grabbed the property deed, his ID, and went to the school with Isadora and Leah. When the secretary started asking questions, Renato put the documents on the table and said, "The house is mine. They live with me. Here's the deed, here's my ID. The girl needs a place. It's her right." The secretary looked at the papers, looked at Isadora, looked at Renato, and filled out the form without asking any more questions. As they left, Leah walked between the two, holding each of their hands. And when the girl started jumping on the squares of the sidewalk as if the ground were a game, Isadora looked at Renato and said, "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I needed to." "Why?" Renato looked at the girl jumping. "Because nobody did anything for me when I needed it, and I know how much it hurts." Isadora stopped walking, and Renato saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was the slow and frightening beginning of trust. That exact moment when someone who has learned to expect the worst begins to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this time it will be different. Months passed, and the farm began to come alive. Renato repaired the corral and bought 2 cows. Isadora expanded the vegetable garden and started selling vegetables at the town market on Saturdays. Leah started school and came home every day with new drawings that she taped to the kitchen wall. The house became filled with things that hadn't been there before. Tablecloths, spices on the windowsill, an old radio that Isadora found in the shed and which, after cleaning, was working again, and books. Isadora read at night after Leah went to sleep, old novels that she borrowed from the traveling library that came to town once a month. Renato saw her reading on the porch with the oil lamp beside her and thought that he had never seen anyone so beautiful doing something so simple. He didn't say anything. He didn't know how. Renato was a man who had forgotten the language of affection. His marriage to Claudia had been an exercise in emotional efficiency. Everything worked, nothing pulsed. And before the marriage, his father, Onofre, hard-hearted, who loved in silence and demonstrated it through his work. Renato learned that a man shows love by repairing fences, not by holding hands. That affection is a roof, not words. But Isadora was disrupting that logic, because she didn't need him to fix anything. She fixed it herself. What she needed, and he was beginning to understand, was something that no hammer or nail could solve. She needed someone to stay, not out of obligation, not out of pity, not as an arrangement, just to stay. The turning point came on a rainy night. A heavy rain, the kind that the interior of Minas Gerais knows well. The sky opened up as if someone had ripped open the lining and all the water in the world had fallen at once. The river that ran behind the farm rose rapidly. Renato was in the corral trying to protect the cows when he heard Isadora scream. He ran home and found her in the yard, in the rain, trying to cover the vegetable garden with a tarp. The water had already washed away part of the garden beds. Renato grabbed the other end of the tarp, and the two pulled together, shouting against the noise of the rain, their feet sinking into the mud. The tarp flew away. The rain won. The garden turned to mud. Isadora stood in the middle of the yard, soaked, looking at the destruction. And for the first time since Renato had known her, she cried. She didn't cry for the garden. She cried for everything. For the mother she lost so young. For the man who ran away. For the shelters. For the nights sleeping on the street with a child at her breast. For the humiliation of not having proof of residence. For the hunger she hid so Leah could eat more. For all the days she woke up and had to invent a reason to keep going. She cried there, standing in the rain, as if the sky were crying along with her, as if the water could wash away what was encrusted inside. Renato did the only thing he knew how to do. He went to her and stood close. He didn't hug her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, soaked too, standing beside her in the mud, looking at the destroyed garden. And after a while, Isadora rested her forehead on his shoulder, slowly, like someone placing a wounded bird on a surface that could be safe or a trap. Renato didn't move. He let her stay, and he felt the weight of her head on his shoulder as the heaviest and lightest thing he had ever held. They stayed like that until the rain subsided. Then they went inside, changed their clothes, and Renato made coffee while Isadora went to see if Leah had woken up. The girl was sleeping like a rock, oblivious to the storm. When Isadora returned to the kitchen, Renato placed the cup in front of her and sat down on the other side of the table. "We replant," he said. Isadora held the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth. "I know, I always replant. I know you replant, but this time you don't have to replant alone." She looked at him. And in that look there was so much that no words could express. There was the fear of believing, the desire to believe, the memory of all the times she believed and regretted it, and beneath it all, fragile as a sprout after the rain, hope. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "We're nothing to each other. You could have fired me on the first day." Renato looked at the cup. "When I arrived here, I was a man who had given up on everything, on myself, on the world, on people. I came to this place to die in peace. Not to die for real, but in that way, to cease to exist slowly, to let the days pass until there was nothing left." He paused. "And then I entered my house, and it smelled of beans. There were flowers on the table. There was a girl drawing a house with a blue window. There was life. And that life was yours, Isadora. You brought life to a place I had let die, including myself." Isadora exhaled slowly, as if releasing a pain she had carried for too long. "I never had anyone who stayed," she said. "Everyone leaves. My mother left. Leah's father left. Places leave. People leave. I am not going. You don't know that. No, but I'm here now, and I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. And if one day I'm not here, it won't be because I chose to leave." Isadora placed the cup on the table and looked at him in a new way. It was no longer the look of someone searching for a trap. It was the look of someone finding solid ground after swimming for a long time. That night, they stayed on the porch until late. They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. They sat on the wooden bench that Renato's father had made and watched the rain go away and the stars appear one by one, as if someone were turning on lights in a very large house. And between them, in the space that still separated their bodies, something was growing. It wasn't passion. It was older than passion. It was the slow and profound recognition that two broken people can, together, form something whole. Not because they complete each other, that is, this is the invention of someone who has never truly broken anything, but because they know the exact shape of the crack and know where not to press. The following weeks were different. There was no declaration of love. There was no dramatic kiss in the rain. What there was a change in the texture of the days. Renato started staying in the kitchen after dinner instead of going straight to the bedroom. Isadora started laughing more, and her laughter became more genuine, less rehearsed. Leah started calling Renato Ray, and one day, without anyone asking, she drew a family, a woman, a girl, and a tall man. She stuck it on the refrigerator with masking tape and said, "This is us." Renato looked at the drawing and felt his throat tighten. He said nothing. But when Isadora passed him in the kitchen that night, he held her hand, gently, for 2 seconds, and then let go. And they both continued as if nothing had happened, but they both knew that everything had happened. It was on a Sunday in October, market day in the city, that Isadora's past resurfaced. She was at the market selling vegetables from her garden, which had been replanted and was already bearing its first fruits, when a man stopped in front of her stall. Tall, handsome in a worn way, with eyes that had that glint of someone who knows he's handsome and uses it as a tool. Isadora turned white. "One?" Renato was on the other side of the market buying pet food when he saw the scene from afar. He saw Isadora recoil. He saw the man approach. He saw his hand touch her arm and Isadora flinch as if she had been electrocuted. Renato walked over there without running, but with a firm step that made people get out of the way. "Are you all right?" he asked, stopping beside Isadora. The man looked Renato up and down. "Who are you?" "I should be asking that." "I am Raphael, Leah's father." Renato looked at Isadora. She was trembling, not from cold, from memory. Raphael flashed a smile that seemed rehearsed. "I came looking for you. I've changed, Isa. I was going through a bad time, but I've changed. I want to meet my daughter. I want to do the right thing." Isadora said nothing. Renato didn't either. But inside, something was on alert, like an animal that smells smoke before seeing the fire. "We can talk somewhere else," Isadora said quietly. "Not here." They went to the square. Renato stayed a few meters away, close enough to hear, far enough to give space. Raphael talked a lot. He said he had found a job, that he was living in Cervello, that he thought about his daughter every day. Isadora listened with a closed face, her hands clutching the hem of her blouse. When Raphael finished, she said a single sentence. "You disappeared when I was 7 months pregnant. I slept on the street with your daughter, and now you come to tell me you've changed." Raphael lowered his head. "I know, I was a coward." "You weren't a coward. A coward is someone who is afraid and runs away. You weren't afraid. You simply didn't care." The silence that followed was heavy. Raphael looked at Renato, then at Isadora, and said, "I have the right to see my daughter." "Law?" Isadora repeated the word as if it were a defective part. "Law is built, Raphael. It's not demanded." He left, promising to return, and he did. The following week, he showed up at the farm with a stuffed animal and a wide smile. Leah looked at him curiously and accepted the toy, but stayed close to Renato the whole time, holding his pants with her hand. Raphael noticed. And the look. What he threw at Renato wasn't out of gratitude. It was out of jealousy. The jealousy of someone who dropped something on the ground and gets angry when they see that someone else took care of it. The visits continued, one a week. Raphael brought gifts, told jokes, tried to win Leah over with the urgency of someone who knows they're at a disadvantage. But Leah was a country girl, raised with silence and truth, and she sensed, as children do, that there was something in Raphael's joy that was too noisy to be real. She accepted the gifts politely, but when Raphael left, she went straight to the balcony where Renato was and sat beside him without saying a word. And Renato understood that that silence was worth more than any stuffed animal. A month later, Raphael showed up with a proposal. He had rented an apartment in Cervello. He wanted Isadora and Leah to live with him. "I want to be a family," he said, standing on the balcony, his arms outstretched as if the gesture were proof enough. Isadora looked at Renato. And in that look, he read everything. The fear of leaving, the fear of staying, the fear of trusting the wrong man again, and, for the first time, the fear of losing something she hadn't even named yet. "I need to think," she said. Raphael left in anger. He slammed the car door and kicked up dust on the road. That night, Renato didn't eat dinner. He went to the shed and sanded wood until his hands ached, not out of anger towards Raphael, out of fear. Fear that Isadora would leave. Fear of reverting to the empty man he had been months before. Fear of losing something whose magnitude he only now understood. And the fear was so great that he couldn't put it into words, so he turned it into work, as his father always did, as all the men in the family always did, sanding and hammering and sawing, as if he could build with his hands what he couldn't say with his mouth. Isadora went to the shed around midnight. Renato was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall with bruised hands and sawdust in his hair. "I'm not going," she said from the doorway. Renato looked at her. "I'm not going with him," she repeated. "Not because he's bad. Maybe he's changed, I don't know. But I know that the place where Leah truly laughs is here. The place where I sleep without fear is here. The place where I feel human is here." She paused. "And the man who stayed by my side in the rain without asking for anything in return is you." Renato stood up. His mouth opened to say something, but what came out wasn't a sentence. It was a gesture. He crossed the shed and stopped in front of her, and with his hand full of sawdust, he touched Isadora's face, slowly, like whoever touches something sacred. She closed her eyes and rested her face against his hand, and Renato felt her warm skin against his rough palm and thought that was it. That was exactly what he had come to seek without knowing it. Not silence, not rest, but the right to touch someone and be touched in return without it costing him his soul. The kiss was simple, without fire, without urgency. It was a kiss from someone who had grown tired of rushing and chosen to take it slow. Their lips met with the naturalness of someone simply finishing a sentence they had begun months ago, on that first night of beans and silence. And when they parted, Isadora smiled. Not the smile she rehearsed for Leah, Not the defensive smile for strangers. A smile that came from a place so deep it seemed to have traversed years of darkness to reach the surface. "I'm scared," she said. "Me too," he replied. "And now?" "Now we're scared together. It's better than being scared alone." Leah woke up the next day and found her mother and Renato having coffee on the porch, sitting closer than usual. She didn't say anything. She just sat between them, picked up her mug of milk, and looked at the backyard where the new vegetable garden was starting to grow. And then, with the tranquility of someone stating the obvious, she said, "The refrigerator design is correct, right, Mom?" Isadora looked at her daughter and then at Renato, and they both laughed. A low, restrained laugh, like someone who doesn't want to scare away the happiness that has just arrived, afraid that it might realize it has been seen and leave. Raphael returned once more. He tried to convince. He tried to negotiate. He tried to pressure. When he realized it wasn't going to work, he showed his true colors. He shouted. He threatened. He said he would go to court, that he would take custody away, that Isadora wasn't fit to raise a daughter living in a stranger's house. Renato heard everything from the balcony, standing with his arms crossed. When Raphael finished, Renato came down the steps and stopped in front of him. "You're leaving now," she said, in a voice that wasn't loud, but carried the weight of someone who wouldn't repeat it. "If you want to see your daughter, find a lawyer and do things the right way. But you're not going to walk into this house screaming? Never again." Raphael glared at him with hatred, but there was something in Renato's eyes, not violence, but certainty, that made Raphael realize there was a wall there he wasn't going to break down. He got in his car and drove away. Renato never knew if Raphael sought legal counsel. No document ever appeared, no summons. Perhaps the interest lasted as long as the interests of men who only want what they lost while it still hurts to lose it. When the pain passes, the interest goes with it. Time did what time does. Leah grew up. One Tuesday, without warning, without ceremony, she started calling Renato Dad, as if changing shoes. "Dad, can you help me with my homework?" And it took Renato 5 seconds to realize she was talking to him. 5 seconds in which the whole world stood still. He looked at Isadora, who was in the kitchen doorway, and she had tears in her eyes and a smile that was both a request for permission and a declaration of fact. "Come here," Renato said to Leah. "Show us your homework." Isadora and Renato got married on a Saturday in May at the town's registry office with Leah as a witness. Isadora wore a simple white dress that a neighbor lent her. Renato wore the same shirt he had worn the day he went to the school to enroll Leah. The justice of the peace performed the ceremony in 10 minutes. Donna Merencia, who happened to be at the registry office, watched from the doorway with her mouth open and her eyes wet. And when Isadora came out, the old woman held her hand and said, "Forgive me, my daughter. I was unfair." Isadora held the old woman's hand back and said, "It's all right, Donna Merencia. You didn't know." And it was true. Nobody knew. Nobody knows what the person in front of us carries until life forces us to look more closely. On the way home, Leah slept in the back seat of the car. Isadora sat with her head against the window watching the dirt road and the mango trees passing by. Renato drove slowly, as on the first day. But now the slowness wasn't tiredness. It was a desire for the journey to last longer. When they arrived, the sun was setting. The house was there, with its white walls and blue windows and the smoke from the chimney that Renato had lit that morning before leaving. He stopped the car and stood looking. And he remembered the day he had arrived and seen that smoke for the first time and how he had felt anger, confusion, invasion. And now I looked at the same smoke and felt that it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Because smoke in the chimney means that someone is inside, that someone lit the fire, that someone is waiting. Isadora touched his hand on the steering wheel. "Shall we go in?" "Let's go." Renato picked Leah up. The girl hadn't even woken up. She just rested her head on his shoulder with the complete confidence of someone who knows she won't fall, and the three of them went inside the house that was his by inheritance, hers by necessity, and theirs by choice. Renato put Leah on the bed, covered her up, and watched her sleeping face. And he thought of his father, of the wooden bench his father had made, of the house his father had built. And he understood that the true inheritance wasn't the land or the walls. It was the possibility that one day someone would enter through that door and transform an empty place into a full place. Not full of things, full of presents. He went back to the kitchen, where Isadora was heating up the coffee in the filter. She looked at him and smiled. And in that smile was everything that neither of them had been able to say in words during all those months. "I found you." Not like you find something you were looking for, but like you find something you didn't even know existed. "I found you in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. And yet, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Renato sat at the table. Isadora served the coffee, and the silence between them was no longer distance. It was the language they had invented together, made of gestures, glances, and the quiet certainty that finally neither of them needed to go anywhere. Because the place was there. It had always been there. I was just waiting for them to arrive.